All right, so today we'll be talking about the Beaux Art and Art Deco, two different and very distinctive movements combined into one lecture, starting with the Beaux Art movement. And actually, this is a night view of the Columbian Exposition, which is one of the main proponents of the Beaux Art. But I wanted to start talking about the main architect that promoted it, this movement in the United States. It actually originates in France, as we'll see in a moment, but it was incredibly popular in the US, and most of the examples we'll talk about are American examples. And this is Richard Morris Hunt, who, and with a famous painting by a famous John Singer Sargent, famous artist. And Hunt is kind of the father of the Beaux Art. And he was the first American to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which is where the style name of Beaux Art comes from, is from the French architecture and design school. And this was the most prominent architecture school in the world at this time in the late 19th century. And really at a time when architecture schools didn't really exist in the US until the very late 19th century. And so if you wanted an academic training and you wanted to be an architect, the thing to do was to go to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and study there and do a grand tour of Europe while you were there, and then you would come back and start a firm or work for someone prominent, and you could really make a great name for yourself because you'd have that credential that most American architects did not have. And he started his own studio and began to train others who maybe couldn't afford to go to Paris, and they started their own firms. And so it almost literally is like a paternal father figure, in the sense that so many people worked for him and then went off and struck out on their own, and they had people work for them, and so on and so on. He also was a founder of the American Institute of Architects, which is still the primary organization of architects throughout the country, and really fully embraced this Beaux-Arts style. So the École in Paris at this time focused on a certain neoclassical architectural design aesthetic, and also a heavy emphasis on orderly planning, especially of large, complex building types. And we're going to see that this translates well into certain public building types as well. The Beaux-Arts also spurs, and the Columbian Exposition that we'll talk about, spurs what's known in the United States as the City Beautiful movement. And we'll talk a little bit about how that ties in with the Columbian Exposition here. So the Columbian Exposition is held in Chicago in 1893. Daniel Burnham, who we've talked about, of Burnham and Root, they were the most prominent, prestigious firm in Chicago. And when Chicago is awarded the exposition, this World's Fair, Burnham and Root are put in charge of planning the overall event. They decided not to try to do all the architecture. They essentially farmed out the architecture of the buildings to architects across the country, but the overall planning and overseeing the construction is handled by Burnham and Root. But of course, Root dies in 1891, not too long after the Chicago was announced to get this fair. And so it's really left to Burnham himself to plan and organize it without his right-hand man, his partner, Root. He brings in Frederick Law Olmsted, who we talked about extensively, the most famous landscape architect in America, to help the overall planning, layout, the urban design of the site, especially since he was somewhat familiar with Jackson Park, having done some work on that. And the exposition is meant to honor the 400th anniversary of Columbus coming to America, which, if you remember your history, you look at the date of Chicago's fair and you notice there's a little discrepancy. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? But the fair is held in 1893. Well, that's partly because everybody was a little behind in getting this fair awarded, and then Chicago, was sort of scrambling once they got it to get it planned, and so it was really delayed a year. and wasn't held till 1893, a year late. And you may have also, by the way, heard that Chicago is known as the Windy City. And you might think that's literally, when you're in the Loop in February and the wind is blowing off the lake, it makes a lot of sense. But actually, the term comes from Chicago's uh, um, uh, lobbying effort to get the fair. That they knew it was going to be held in the United States, but would it be New York? Would it be Boston, or maybe some other city? And Chicago really wanted it, and so the Chicago boosters really promoted the city as this great place, and it ought to be in Chicago, and they had all their reasons for it. And the East Coast papers, the New York City papers, they were like, oh, these blowhards, these windy Chicagoans, out there trying to promote this cattle town that they, New York probably still thinks of Chicago as this sort of second-rate city, and nevertheless, we were awarded the fair, and it becomes probably the most consequential World's Fair ever held. So here is a painting of Daniel Burnham, remembering what he looks like. And this fair is only a success because of Burnham. He doesn't really drive the architectural expression that becomes so famous, but the only way this happens and gets built is because of his incredible abilities to manage and oversee and plan this very complicated construction project. And here we have essentially a colored map of the exposition. It's held in Jackson Park down on the south side along the lakefront. And at that time, Jackson Park was largely undeveloped. Olmsted had developed some plans to improve the park, but they hadn't really been acted upon to any great extent. So this was almost a blank slate. It was a perfect place, perfect amount of space and size, and it had this beautiful lakefront site right down near Hyde Park and Woodlawn. And so it was a great opportunity for Chicago to develop this fair. And it was always meant to be temporary. The only permanent building planned was the Fine Arts building, which was converted into the Museum of Science and Industry eventually. So the rest of the buildings were going to be temporary. They were built with an exterior of a sort of plaster, they call it staff, which is really sort of a plaster mix. It's a little more durable to withstand, the exterior environment, but really for only a season. And they knew it would deteriorate after the first winter here in Chicago, and that was the plan. It was all going to be torn down. And here we see the main site. Sure, why my clicker back on here. Here we see the main site. The Museum of Science and Industry is right up here. That is still there today. The main Court of Honor and Lagoon is right along here, and this is where the most primary buildings are located. Wooded Island, which still exists in an altered form, is this more naturalist, picturesque landscape right in here. And then the very famous Midway Plaisance extends out along here west from the fair. And this is the Midway Plaisance was where these kind of carnival aspect of the fair would be had. The Ferris Wheel was out here, the sort of exhibits and shows and entertainments and so forth would be along there. And then the name, when you go to a carnival or something and they talk about the Midway, that name Midway comes from the Midway Plaisance of the Columbian Exposition. And this was hugely successful. Over 22 million people came over several months in the summer and early fall of 1893. That compares pretty favorably to, let me go one more slide here. It compares pretty favorably to all but the exposition in Paris of 1889, which is when the Eiffel Tower was built. If you compare that to the London Fair of 1851, remember that from the Crystal Palace, that only had about 6 million people. And it was also huge. It was over 633 acres and a huge number of exhibits, 65,000. So this was pretty massive. And most people think there would have been even more attendance if there hadn't been a pretty severe recession in 1893 in America. So That it sort of held some of the attendance down. But nevertheless, people could come from all over the country because Chicago was a railroad hub, and it was easy to get on a train almost anywhere in the United States and get easily to Chicago. So here is a more detailed map of just the primary area of the fair with Lake Michigan on the right. And the Grand Basin, the Court of Honor, is right down in this area here. There was an administrative building, and you see these large buildings, the manufacturers and liberal arts building. This was the largest building in the world when it was completed, and it was only meant to last for a few months. Agriculture building, machinery hall, electricity, mines. There's a railroad terminal. It had its own railroad station, so you could get a special express train from New York City, and it would take you right into the heart of the fair. You wouldn't have to go into the city and then, make your way down to the fair. There's a transportation building. Here's that wooded island, and up here again at the top is the Palace of Fine Arts. And the fair became known as the White City. The nickname kind of got applied to here. And this is because the architecture largely consisted of this white stucco exterior. And Americans had never seen anything like this before. American cities were, first of all, largely built of, sort of brown and red brick and stone. And white stone and marble was much less common, and even if you used that, it was dirty within a few months because of the massive pollution that existed in America and throughout most of the industrial world at the time, and because of the massive use of coal for both powering these factories, and even people's homes and boilers were fueled by coal, and coal has a extensive soot and dirt, so that would spread through the atmosphere, and the buildings would get pretty dirty pretty quickly. But you have this brand new city built literally in just a matter of a few months, and it's only meant to last a few months, and so it never had a chance to get dirty. And so when people came here, and when they see photographs, if they didn't make it, they saw this beautiful city of white all around them, and it just really blew them away that a city could, an urban environment could be so beautiful. And really, there was only a few exceptions to that general theme of white buildings, one of them being Louis Sullivan's transportation building, which I'll show you in a minute. Here's a sort of bird's eye view of it from the lake. You can see there was, boat excursions that you could take. And here's the Grand Court of Honor with a grand basin similar to the Grand Canal at Versailles. There's a domed administration building. You see this massive machinery building, the wooded island, and up the far right over here is the Museum of Science and Industry, which was built to be the Fine Arts building. And there were a number of photographs taken. There's just huge amounts of photography from the fair, and they even sold picture books that you could buy as tourist trinkets and take home with you, or sell them if you couldn't. You could send them to your friends that couldn't get to the fair. So here's a view looking west of the Court of Honor, the Grand Basin. You can see that Richard Morris Hunt, the architect I mentioned, he designed, one of the most prominent buildings of the fair, the administration building, which is this domed structure, neoclassical, sits at the end of this lagoon with a statue of the Republic facing it, sort of based on the image of Columbia. And then all around it you see are these white neoclassical buildings. And this is that night view I showed you at the beginning. And electricity wasn't invented here, or it wasn't the first time it was used here, but it was such a new thing. And Edison supplied all the electric light bulbs and the electric work here. No one had ever been in an urban environment where with electric street lights, and even the buildings were lit up and outlined, which we still do today in some buildings. And certainly, they might have seen, the little bare Edison bulbs inside an office or building, but to have an entire urban landscape like this lit up with electricity was amazing to people, and really foretold the future of cities, that you could light them up. And it made a city, part of the City Beautiful movement was the idea is that, a city didn't have to be a dangerous place at night. It could be, you could have these promenades along waterfronts, and they were lit with electric lighting, so people had a sense of safety and security that they normally didn't have, because once it got dark out, the cities were pretty dark. This is a view of the Statue of the Republic. There's actually a small-scale reproduction of this in Jackson Park still. It's, I don't know, maybe a third of the size of the original. Daniel Chester French, very famous sculptor. I believe he did the Lincoln Memorial sculpture. Henry Bacon is another famous architect that did a lot of work in Washington, D.C. And if more views, this is the view of Machinery Hall, and you can see this neoclassical architecture that's very prominent. It's got a little mix of the temple front that you would expect to see. The towers are a little bit of an oddity. They almost look Spanish, like the towers at the Sevilla Cathedral or something. But still, this is kind of classical to Beaux-Arts architecture. It doesn't really rely on a specific architectural reference. It just is this pastiche of mostly neoclassical forms and components all thrown together, sometimes into a cohesive form, and in this case, not all that much. Peabody and Stearns was the architect for this. Many of the architects that contributed to the fair architecture were prominent East Coast architects, which caused Louis Sullivan to complain bitterly that the fair was sort of outshone by all these East Coast architects doing this, historical revival of neoclassical, and he felt it really, in fact, he's quoted as saying it set back architecture 50 years, because he really believed, and many of the other Chicago school architects believed in this sort of modern architecture that was of its time and place and would represent this, new modern movement in America with the turn of the century especially, and instead what we got at the fair was this looking back to classical Greece and Rome. But they were pretty much outshone. The people loved this white neoclassical architecture so much that it really took off. So this is a black and white view of Sullivan's transportation building, and it's a little hard to see, but we see a very classical Sullivan archway here on his more typical ornamentation that he is very well known for. And in the next slide, I have a color rendering of it to give you a sense of it. It was actually sort of golden in color primarily, and was remarked upon by a few critics, but for the most part, this building was ignored. People tended to, the critics and the newspapers all across the country tended to promote this white neoclassical architecture and how beautiful it was, and they ignored this, odd design work that was being done in the city by Chicago by people like Sullivan, and so it really got outshone by the other neoclassical architecture. This is the women's building, and it was designed by a female architect, and this was an exhibition hall to highlight the contributions of women to arts and culture. And it was felt by actually Bertha Palmer, the wife of Potter Palmer, probably the richest man in Chicago, that it ought to be a design competition to design the building open to women, and should have maybe a woman architect design it. There weren't a lot to choose from at the time. There were very few women in architecture at the time, but they actually got about a dozen or so applications, and the winner was Sophia Hayden, who happened to be the first woman to graduate from MIT's architecture program, which was a relatively new program in and of itself. She graduates in 1890. She was very talented. She had claimed honors on graduation, but she couldn't really find any work. Male architects didn't want to hire a woman, and so she only kind of contributed an entry at the last minute, almost on a lark, sort of like, well, what have I got to lose? and she had been teaching drafting really at a local technical school in Boston, I think, and she won. She was 21 years old, which is pretty amazing in and of itself. And in many ways, she kind of got in over her head. I mean, she certainly faced this discrimination being a woman, but the pressures, even on the established firms, were immense because they had to design very large, very complicated buildings in a very short amount of time, and they had to be built very quickly and very cheaply. And that was honestly a struggle for some of the more prestigious firms. And Burnham was not averse to just going ahead and changing things of their design in order to get it done. And she, was only 21 and didn't have this experience of working in firms, and so really struggled with it and really eventually got fired. But the design essentially is hers. I should also note she got literally 1/10 the fee that the other male architects were given, and that probably contributed to her inability to fully manage the construction process. But it really kind of demoralized her, and this was the only building that she actually built, designed, and that was built. And after this, never really practiced architecture again. So kind of a very quick little burning or flaming star that unfortunately didn't last. This is a view of the wooded island right here, and this still largely exists, and this was the site of the Japanese Hoeden, which was the nation of Japan's contribution to the fair. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But here we also see Hayden's women's building right here, sort of at the center behind the island. And further back, the tallest thing on the skyline here, looking west, is the Ferris wheel on the Midway Plaisance. I'll show you a detail of that in a minute too. So the Hoeden by the nation of Japan, this was one contrast, other than Louis Sullivan's building, in the main area of the fair to be not this neoclassical white architecture. This is very traditional. It's based on a traditional, important Japanese temple form. And if you remember from our lecture last fall on Japanese temple architecture, it's a good replication of that. And this was immensely influential to Frank Lloyd Wright. He probably had a seasonal pass to the fair. If you lived in Chicago, you could get a whole pass and you could come and go as you wanted. And I doubt he spent very much time in the court of honor looking at the neoclassical architecture, but he definitely wrote about spending a great deal of time at the Hoeden and just studying this immensely. And he had a long affinity with Japanese culture and art and architecture that really begins right here with the Hoeden at the Columbian Exposition. So yes, the Columbian Exposition is most famous for spurring the Beaux-Arts architecture, but it also has really what spurs and influences Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1890s to develop his prairie style of architecture. And here's another view of the Hoeden with the Japanese lanterns. And there were quite a few Japanese art prints located within the complex, and Wright became a huge collector of Japanese prints as well. This was meant to be permanent, but unfortunately was destroyed in a fire, I don't know, the year after the fair or so, and no longer survives, other than just a few photographs that we see here. So one of the most famous elements of the fair was the Ferris wheel. This was designed and built by George Washington Ferris, and hence the name Ferris Wheel. And this was meant to be the equivalent to the Eiffel Tower from the 1889 fair. Chicago saw how successful that tower was for people. They paid a fee to go ride an elevator to the top and had this bird's eye view of Paris, and that made the fair a lot of money. And they knew in Chicago that they needed an attraction like this, the headliner, to help draw in crowds to just hang out at the carnival and pay a lot of money and help to support financially, the fair. And for a long time in the planning, they had no idea what it would be. They had submitted proposals and nothing really was coming forth. And finally, almost at the last minute, Ferris steps up and said, "Hey, those newfangled bicycles that are really popular that people are riding around in parks. What if I made a giant bicycle wheel, and along the perimeter of the wheel are these essentially rail cars that are glazed, and you can fit about 20 people into this car, and they'll pay a fee, and then it'll slowly revolve around, and they'll have these incredible vistas of the lake and of the fair and even of the skyline up at the loop, several miles north." And it worked, and it became quite famous. And of course, now every two-bit county fair has to have a Ferris wheel to it. And we have a small-scale reproduction at Navy Pier, and I forget the size, but it's maybe no more than half the size of the original Ferris wheel. So when you look at that next time, you get a sense of how giant the original Ferris wheel was. And this is a view from the Ferris wheel as you're riding up to the top. This is looking east down the Midway Plaisance, and you can see sort of very faintly some of the main buildings of the fair off in the distance there. And like I said, the Midway was the carnival aspect of it. This is where you could have shows, and it was silly stuff, and different countries contributed buildings. So you could go to a brew house, representing Germany, or you could see African pygmies, or you could see, Indian, Native American Indian shows. Wild Buffalo Bill Cody, I think, had a show running here where he was shooting buffalo or something like that. All politically non-correct, or much of it politically non-correct in today's world. But this was the way people kind of saw what different cultures were like in the 1890s. And as I mentioned, the Palace of Fine Arts, which was to be the art gallery for the show, was built more permanently, and it was expected that this building would survive and would become a museum for the city of Chicago. This was designed by Charles Atwood, Burnham's design partner at that time. This is one of his great works in that short career that he had. And of course, today it serves as the Museum of Science and Industry, largely the same exterior form that Atwood designed. And this is meant to show you a link to a video. Of course, it all got torn down, and so we can't really see anything other than photos, but I've put this video link up on the YouTube page, and you can do a sort of 3D model simulated walkthrough of the fair. So it's only a few minutes long, and you can kind of get a feel of what it might have been like to walk around the fair in 1893. And it's also cool 3D modeling, so check that out on the YouTube page. I'm going to stop the recording.